So my good friends at KNF Concepts sent me a circular polarizing filter, or CPL filter, to test out. And I figured while I was testing it, I would make this video to be able to talk about CPL filters, what they are, how they work, because I really feel like CPL filters are something that every photographer or videographer should have in their bag. Now, it's not a filter that you're going to use all the time, but it definitely has its uses and it really comes in handy a lot of times. So before we talk about the filter, let's first talk about polarized light. What exactly is polarized light? I Googled it because I don't really know. I didn't know what it was. I've used CPL filters for forever, but I didn't really know how to explain what polarized light was. So I looked it up and I could not understand it. It was a scientific explanation that was well above my comprehension. It basically had to do with like the wavelengths of light and a bunch of other stuff. You can certainly go Google it if that's your thing. So I can't really explain it, but some light is polarized. That's as good as it's going to get. I'm sorry, that's as good as it's going to get. Some light is polarized. And so the point of a CPL filter is to block that polarized light. Now, the way that a CPL filter essentially works, you have two pieces of glass that is matted together and they rotate independently of each other and they are polarized linearly. And so as you rotate the glass, when those two pieces of glass perpendict each other, that's when you get the effect of a CPL filter. Now, in mentioning that, it's also important to mention that not all light is polarized, and your most polarized light is going to come when it is perpendicular to your light source. So if you have the sun in front of you or the sun behind you and you use a CPL filter, you're not really going to see any difference because that light isn't really polarized. And so if the light isn't polarized, the filter isn't going to do anything. But if you are perpendicular to it, or 90 degrees or somewhere in that range, you don't have to be exactly 90 degrees, but essentially you want to have your light source more to your side and you're going this way, that's when you will see the effect of a polarizing filter. Now, another thing to note about CPL filters is that they don't do anything on metallic surfaces, which may be disappointing to you if you're not familiar with CPL filters, because you know metallic surfaces tend to be the most reflective. So that's the time when you would probably want to use a CPL filter. Now, again, this goes into science and I can't really explain it, but the reason for that is that metallic surfaces do not reflect light polarization. The light that is reflected is not polarized. So if the light is not polarized, then a CPL filter is essentially useless. So you may be wondering, how does a CPL filter work with cars? Because people who do automotive photography and when they shoot video, they always use CPL filters to reduce reflections, and it is effective. The reason for that is because most cars are steel, which is technically not a metal. It is an alloy, a compound. There is some metal in it, but steel is kind of its own different thing. And so steel actually does reflect polarized light, and that is the reason why CPL filters work. Now let's talk about when you would want to use a CPL filter. Now, one of the most common uses is when you are photographing or you are recording water, and you want to remove the reflections off of water. Water is extremely reflective, and so if you're shooting something to where you want to see what's underneath the surface of the water, a CPL filter is going to be very effective for you because it's going to cut that glare and it's going to allow you to essentially penetrate the water and really be able to see what's underneath the water. Now, another scenario where you use a CPL filter is when you want to bring out the color or the cloud texture in the sky. The sky is also another surface that is highly reflective with polarized light. And so by using a CPL filter, you can really cut through that reflection and it'll really bring out the blue in the sky and it'll really bring out the texture in the clouds. Because you really have to think reflections essentially reduce saturation and it reduces contrast. And so by cutting through those two things, it's going to make your color more vibrant and it's going to make your contrast more contrasty. That was a terrible way to explain it, but it adds more contrast. And so there really is a benefit in using CPL filters with the sky. CPL filters are also reflective in cutting through haze, because essentially all haze is light that is being reflected off of particles in the sky. So the denser those particles, the thicker the haze. So by using a CPL filter, you can really cut through that haze, and it'll just, again, add more contrast and saturation, and to a degree sharpness to what you're shooting. Now, this is typically done when you're doing like landscape photography and that sort of thing, but it can be effective. Now, speaking of the sky and landscapes, when you're shooting landscapes, CPL filters are very effective, especially when you're shooting things like trees, or I'll use the landscape word, foliage. Anytime you're shooting things like that, or any type of surface within your landscape that's highly reflective, a CPL is really going to be good for that, because it's going to do exactly what I just mentioned. It's going to increase that saturation and increase the contrast. And obviously when you're shooting a landscape, that's exactly what you want in your landscape. You want that saturation, you want that contrast, you want that sharpness, and the reflections are going to minimize that. So by using the CPL filter, you can cut through that. It really will make the greens in foliage so much greener. It brings out a lot of color in like the tans and the browns of like dirt, sand, that sort of thing. Obviously the sky as well. So very effective with landscapes. Definitely would want to have a CPL filter on hand for that. And then, as I mentioned, also cars. If you are doing any type of automotive photography or videography, you have to have a CPL filter. You just have to. You will look very amateurish if you shoot cars and they have all of the reflections. You have to have a CPL filter, because you really need to cut through that. When you think about it, cars in its entirety, minus the tires, is just one giant reflective surface. So if that is your subject, you certainly don't want your subject to just be reflecting everything in the environment. It's just not going to be a pleasing shot. So you definitely want that CPL to be able to reduce those reflections. It also helps with shooting through glass, windows, the windshield. If you're doing video or for photography, this applies to both. But if you're trying to shoot a subject that's behind glass, this also is the case if you were shooting at a restaurant or something like that. If you're shooting through glass, the CPL filter will be very effective, because it will reduce those reflections that you're getting from the outside, and it will allow your subject to pop through. Now, one of the great things about CPL filters, and why I prefer the circular ones over just your square filters that just have what it has, is that you can adjust the intensity of how much you are cutting that polarization. Because for the example of if you were shooting someone that was inside like a coffee shop and you were outside, you may not want to get rid of those reflections entirely, right? Because you would want people to be able to tell that you're shooting through a window. So you may not want to get rid of all of the reflections, but you want to reduce them a little bit. So that's where your circular polarizers are really nice, because, as you turn it, again, the strength of the polarization will either increase or decrease. So you really have control over how much reflections you're getting rid of. So there you have it. You now are certified in circular polarizing filters. So now put your phone down or get off of your computer and go outside and shoot something. Get out of here.